Right now, while you're watching this video, there's a quiet transformation happening just a few hundred miles from the American mainland that could fundamentally reshape how power works in this hemisphere. We're not talking about headlines or breaking news alerts. We're talking about the kind of strategic positioning that happens in the shadows, the military equivalent of chess players moving pieces into place long before the endgame becomes obvious. And here's what makes this moment so fascinating. The patterns we're seeing in the Caribbean aren't just about one potential conflict. They're a masterclass in how modern military strategy actually works, how nations project power, and how the geography of a region can determine everything from diplomatic leverage to the outcome of conflicts that haven't even started yet. Over the next 10 minutes, we're going to decode the strategic logic behind Caribbean military positioning, and by the end, you'll understand why this relatively small body of water might be one of the most important strategic spaces on the planet right now. Let's start with a fundamental question that most people never really think about. Why does geography still matter in an age of intercontinental missiles, cyber warfare, and satellite surveillance? You'd think that in the 21st century, physical location would be almost irrelevant. But here's the paradox that military strategists have known for centuries. The more technologically advanced warfare becomes, the more critical certain geographic positions become. And the Caribbean sits at the intersection of some of the most important strategic calculations any military planner has to make. Think about it from a purely logistical standpoint. If you're trying to project military power into South America, Central America, or even just maintain secure shipping lanes for global commerce, the Caribbean is your gateway. It's not just about having ships or planes with long range. It's about response time, about having assets close enough to react to emerging situations in hours rather than days. It's about creating what military strategists call a persistent presence, where the mere fact of your proximity changes calculations for every other actor in the region. When you understand this principle, you start to see why certain islands, certain ports, certain airfields that might seem insignificant to the average person become absolutely critical in the strategic calculus. Now, let's talk about what makes Caribbean military strategy so different from other theaters of operation. In places like the Middle East or Eastern Europe, you're often dealing with land-based conflicts where armies, tanks, and ground forces play the primary role. But Caribbean strategy is fundamentally about what military planners call sea control and power projection from maritime platforms. This creates a completely different kind of chess game. Every island becomes a potential base. Every stretch of water becomes a highway or a choke point. Every port becomes a logistics hub that can either enable or deny operations across thousands of miles. The genius of Caribbean positioning is that it allows for what's called economy of force. Instead of maintaining massive permanent bases that cost billions and create political complications, modern military strategy favors a network approach. You reactivate facilities as needed. You rotate assets through multiple locations. You create redundancy so that no single point of failure can compromise your entire strategy. This is why we're seeing renewed interest in facilities that were mothballed decades ago. They're not being fully rebuilt into Cold War-style megabases. They're being turned into flexible nodes in a distributed network that can expand or contract based on operational needs. Here's where it gets really interesting from a strategic theory perspective. There's a concept in military planning called anti-access and area denial, usually shortened to A2AD. The basic idea is this. If you can make it difficult or costly for an adversary to operate in a certain geographic space, you don't necessarily need to win a direct confrontation. You just need to raise the price of entry high enough that they reconsider their options. Now, this works in both directions. When the United States positions naval and air assets throughout the Caribbean, it's creating an A2AD umbrella that makes it extremely challenging for extrahemispheric powers to establish a meaningful presence. But the reverse is also true. If a nation like Venezuela, backed by external support, can deploy credible anti-ship missiles, coastal defenses, and submarine capabilities, they create their own local A2AD bubble that complicates any potential intervention. This is the real strategic competition we're talking about. It's not about who has the bigger military or who can win a conventional slugfest. It's about who can make operating in their preferred areas too costly for their opponents. And this is where the Caribbean becomes this fascinating laboratory for modern military strategy, because you have multiple powers trying to establish these overlapping zones of control and denial in a relatively compact geographic space. Let's drill down into the actual capabilities that make this kind of strategy possible, because understanding the tools helps you understand the game. Modern naval destroyers aren't just floating gun platforms anymore. They're essentially mobile command centers bristling with sensors that can track everything from incoming missiles to submarine movements hundreds of miles away. When a destroyer equipped with Aegis systems positions itself in Caribbean waters, it's not just defending itself. It's creating a protective dome that extends far beyond the ship, coordinating air defense for entire task forces, gathering intelligence, and serving as a node in a much larger battle network. This is what military theorists mean when they talk about networked warfare. Each individual platform becomes exponentially more powerful when it can share data and coordinate actions with every other friendly asset in the theater. Then you have the submarine dimension, which operates on completely different principles. Surface ships, no matter how powerful, are visible. Satellites can track them. Reconnaissance aircraft can find them. But submarines, especially nuclear-powered attack subs, can operate for months at a time in complete stealth. They become these invisible chess pieces that force your opponent to worry about threats they can't see or confirm. A single submarine prowling the approaches to a major port doesn't just threaten ships, it creates uncertainty that freezes decision-making and forces defensive postures that tie up resources. This is psychological warfare through capability, and it's why submarine forces punch so far above their weight in strategic terms. But here's what often gets overlooked in discussions of military hardware: the human and organizational dimension of power projection. You can have the most sophisticated ships and aircraft in the world, but if you can't sustain them, if you can't coordinate their actions, if you can't adapt to changing circumstances in real time, your technological advantage evaporates fast. This is why logistics infrastructure, those unglamorous airfields and ports and supply depots, matter so much. Wars aren't won by who shoots first. They're won by who can maintain operational tempo longer, who can sustain complex operations across time and distance, who has the organizational depth to absorb setbacks and keep functioning. When you see reports of airfields being upgraded or ports being reactivated, what you're really seeing is the establishment of that logistics backbone. It's not sexy. It doesn't make for dramatic headlines, but it's the difference between a military force that can operate for days versus one that can operate for months. And in any sustained conflict, that organizational endurance becomes the determining factor. Now let's flip the board and look at this from the defensive perspective, because that's where things get tactically fascinating. When you're facing a technologically superior opponent with overwhelming firepower and complete information dominance, conventional military wisdom says you're finished before you start. But history is full of examples where weaker forces have successfully denied objectives to stronger ones by understanding the strategic landscape and leveraging asymmetric advantages. The key is never trying to match your opponent's strengths. Instead, you exploit the constraints they operate under. Here's a principle that applies whether we're talking about Caribbean defense or insurgencies in the Middle East, or resistance movements throughout history. The defender, with local knowledge, fighting on familiar terrain, can impose costs that the attacker isn't willing to pay. It's not about winning battles in the conventional sense. It's about making the operational environment so complex, so costly, so unpredictable that your opponent's advantages in firepower and technology don't translate into decisive results. This is where tactics like dispersing your forces, using civilian infrastructure for dual purposes, employing small, fast-moving units instead of concentrated formations, and leveraging terrain that neutralizes technological advantages come into play. In a maritime context, this might mean using swarms of small boats that are individually insignificant but collectively overwhelming. It might mean positioning anti-ship missiles in ways that create kill zones an attacker has to navigate. It might mean using commercial shipping patterns to mask military movements. The specific tactics matter less than understanding the underlying principle. Asymmetric warfare is about using the attacker's sophistication against them, forcing them to make calculations where precision strikes might hit civilian targets, where rules of engagement create hesitation, where the fog of war is thickest. Let's talk about the role of external powers in regional conflicts, because this is where Caribbean strategy connects to much larger geopolitical patterns. Throughout history, regional conflicts have often become proxy battlegrounds for great power competition. The Caribbean is no different. When we see discussions of Russian or Chinese involvement in the Western Hemisphere, it's tempting to view this through a simplistic lens of direct military confrontation. But that's not really how great power competition works in the modern era. Instead, it's about creating dilemmas for your opponent, forcing them to spread resources, introducing uncertainty into their planning, and demonstrating that their sphere of influence isn't as secure as they might think. From the perspective of a power like Russia, they don't need to establish a massive military presence in Venezuela to achieve strategic effects. They just need to introduce enough capability that the United States has to take the possibility seriously. This forces American planners to dedicate resources to monitoring threats that might never materialize, to maintain readiness for contingencies that might never occur, to worry about vulnerabilities in what they've historically considered their secure backyard. This is strategic leverage achieved through relatively minimal investment, and it's a pattern we see repeated across the globe. The counter to this, of course, is what we might call deterrence through positioning. By maintaining visible, capable forces in the region, the United States sends the message that any attempt to establish hostile presence will face overwhelming response. It's a signaling game where both sides are trying to shape the other's calculations without necessarily wanting actual conflict. This is the modern version of gunboat diplomacy, but played out with guided missile destroyers, reconnaissance aircraft, and the quiet movements of submarines. Here's something that doesn't get discussed enough: the economic dimension of military positioning. We tend to think of military strategy and economic policy as separate domains, but they're deeply intertwined, especially in regions where energy resources, shipping lanes, and trade routes are at stake. The Caribbean isn't just strategically important for military reasons, it's a critical corridor for energy shipments, container traffic, and basically all maritime commerce moving between South America and the rest of the world. This means that military positioning in the Caribbean has immediate economic implications. The ability to secure or disrupt shipping, to protect or threaten oil exports, to guarantee or deny access to ports, creates leverage that extends far beyond purely military considerations. This is why you'll often see what appears to be military posturing that's really about economic pressure. Naval operations that intercept shipping, air patrols that monitor energy infrastructure, submarine deployments that create uncertainty about maritime security. These aren't preparation for conventional warfare. They're tools of economic coercion, ways of signaling that a target nation's economic lifelines can be severed if necessary. And in the modern world, where nations are so economically interconnected, this kind of leverage can be more powerful than traditional military threats. Let me share a concept that changes how you think about all of this: the idea of graduated escalation ladders. Military strategists don't think in terms of peace versus war as a binary state. Instead, they envision a spectrum of actions ranging from routine operations through various levels of crisis to actual armed conflict. Each rung on this ladder represents an escalation in tension and capability deployment, but also a decision point where actors can choose to climb higher, maintain the current level, or de-escalate. What we're seeing in Caribbean positioning right now exists somewhere in the middle of this ladder. It's not routine peacetime operations, but it's also nowhere near the top rungs where shots are actually being fired. Understanding this framework helps explain actions that might otherwise seem contradictory. Why reactivate bases if you're not planning immediate action? Because you're moving up the escalation ladder to create options and demonstrate capability. Why deploy sophisticated assets to address what might seem like manageable threats? Because you're signaling where on the ladder you're prepared to climb if circumstances change. Every movement, every deployment, every infrastructure activation is a form of communication in this escalation language. And the art of strategy is knowing how to climb or descend these ladders in ways that achieve your objectives without losing control of the escalation process. Here's the truly crucial insight about Caribbean military strategy that ties everything together. It's ultimately about maintaining freedom of action while denying it to others. In strategic theory, this is sometimes called escalation dominance, the ability to compete credibly at any level of conflict and force your opponent to either back down or escalate to levels where they're at a disadvantage. When the United States positions capable forces throughout the Caribbean, when it reactivates forward operating locations, when it demonstrates the ability to sustain complex operations close to potential flashpoints, it's establishing escalation dominance. It's saying, we can match or exceed any level of competition you're prepared to engage in, and we can do it in your neighborhood. But this kind of dominance requires constant maintenance. It's not something you established once and walk away from. It requires demonstrating capability, updating systems, adapting to new threats, and showing the will to actually use the forces you've positioned. This is why we see cycles of attention to regions like the Caribbean. Strategic priorities shift based on global events, but the underlying geographic logic never changes. The Caribbean will always be strategically important to the United States because of its proximity, just as it will always be attractive to powers seeking to challenge American influence precisely because operations there carry such symbolic and practical weight. As we wrap up, I want you to think about what all of this means for how we understand international relations and military strategy in our current era. We often talk about modern conflicts in terms of cyber warfare, space-based capabilities, or hypersonic weapons. And yes, those frontiers matter, but what Caribbean positioning demonstrates is that old-fashioned geography, the ability to put forces in specific places and sustain them there, remains absolutely fundamental to how power works in the international system. The tools have gotten more sophisticated, the platforms more capable, the information networks more complex. But the basic strategic logic of controlling key geographic spaces, of projecting power from advanced positions, of denying adversaries freedom of action, that's unchanged since the age of sail. What makes our current moment unique is the compression of timescales and the expansion of awareness. Movements that would have taken weeks to detect and months to respond to in previous eras now unfold in hours, tracked in real time by satellite networks and analyzed by artificial intelligence. This doesn't make geography irrelevant. If anything, it makes controlling the right geographic spaces even more valuable, because the side that can respond fastest from well-positioned assets has overwhelming advantages in any developing crisis. The Caribbean is unlikely to become a major battlefield in any traditional sense. The economic costs, the political complications, the risk of escalation spiraling beyond anyone's control, these factors create strong incentives for all sides to compete below the threshold of actual warfare. But that doesn't make the positioning, the investments in infrastructure, the deployment of capabilities any less important. In many ways, successful strategy is about winning without fighting, about establishing such clear dominance that conflict becomes unnecessary. That's the real game being played in the Caribbean right now. And understanding that strategic logic helps you decode not just what's happening in this region, but how military power actually works in our interconnected, contested, yet hopefully still peaceful world.